Okay, so today I'm going to walk you through my complete real estate videography and photography setup while using Fuji. I recently did this, but a lot of it pertained mostly to Sony. So I know some of you guys do shoot Fuji, so I want to go ahead and share my settings along with the lenses that I choose to use, along with SD cards, gimbal, and drone. So let's get started. What's good, everybody? Ken here. You're watching OriginaldoBo, and in today's video, we're talking about real estate videography and photography kit. Really quick though, if you want to check out some of the work that I've done with the Fuji or any of the other cameras, you can check out the links in the description for Instagram, Twitter. I try to post photos and video there pretty regularly. You can also follow me on Facebook, which I try to give weekly updates on all this stuff that's occurring here. So I've got a couple of things in front of me. First thing I want to talk about is my cameras that I am shooting on, because I think this is probably the most important thing to talk about. So I do shoot on two cameras. Yes, I do know that Fuji makes it really simple to go back and forth between video settings along with photography settings, but I've always found it more appealing and easier to use two different cameras when I'm shooting video. That way I have a camera that's solely dedicated to just shooting photos, and I have a camera that's solely dedicated to just shooting video. But you don't have to do this, and obviously since Fuji makes it easier, it's sort of a, not really a big deal. But I do this mostly because of battery. I like to be able to roll into one shoot and the next, and I find myself lately not shooting as much video as I used to. So when it comes to photos, I absolutely love the Fuji system simply because of these dials do make it very, very simple. Now I shoot in bracketed exposures. However, I don't edit bracketed exposures. I know that's sort of a weird thing to say, but I shoot in 3 brackets and I use the -1 EV and the +1 EV. So basically 3 brackets at an exposure value of 1 stop. That's how I shoot. And then what I'll typically do is look at the best ambient exposure out of those shots, and I'll blend it with a flash shot. So I do use flash. I am using still the 8200 Pro, which I find to be a phenomenal flash. Now, one of the things that I had to consider when I was moving over to Fuji is the fact that none of my old flash triggers would work from Sony. I had to buy a new flash trigger. So the flash trigger that I'm using is the X Pro F. This is made for Fuji. I use this with the Godox version for Sony, and it worked phenomenal. So I got the same one here, and I'm happy to report that it works just as well as it did on Sony. So this is the Godox X Pro F. I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to check this out. But this allows me to not have to worry about replacing all of my flashes. Most of my flashes were made for Sony or Canon at one point. So because of this, I don't have to replace them. As long as I'm still using my Godox flash, they'll sync up with this trigger, no problem. Now the 8200 Pro works great, but what I find is I'll set this over to the single shot mode, and I'll take one single exposure using the flash at full power, and typically I'm putting my shutter at 125 to 200, and I find that that gives me a really nice balanced exposure, and it's a good starting point. And typically with that one single flash shot, I don't have to worry about the windows. The window pull is already done. I've also done a video on how I edit my photos, and just because I'm shooting Fuji doesn't mean any of that changes. The process is still the same. However, I am not using Capture One because I just don't see the point when I'm shooting at f8 or f7 with these lenses. It's already sharp enough. I don't have to worry about enhancing the details, and it's going to get compressed once it gets uploaded to MLS. Now, if this was something that was going to be printed, possibly for a magazine or something, I'd probably consider processing first through Capture One before I take it into Photoshop. But when you're editing real estate photography, you're definitely going to need to use Photoshop. It's honestly, you can't get around it, put it that way. All right, so I do set my ISO. I leave it at 500. Now, when I do the flash, I typically will drop that ISO to 200. That still gives me enough of power to that flash to be able to cover most rooms. Now, some rooms you have seen me do this where I'll take a flash on either side of the room, so that way I can sort of paint the image in. But those are my settings. I use bracketed exposure shots. Before I run the flash, I'll turn my flash on, set it over to single shot. I'm at ISO 200. Typically shutter speeds, I'll start at 125 or I'll bump it up to 200. And again, that gives me a nice even flash appeal. And I have to say that Fuji flash definitely works a lot better than the Sony, and I'm also getting cleaner colors straight out of the camera as far as white balance is concerned. All right, let's move over to the Fuji XT4 because this is what I'm using for video. So for video, I like to shoot in 4K 60 frames per second. I never had this capability before on my other cameras. All the other cameras would only allow me to shoot in 30 frames per second in 4K at the highest available frame rate. Now I've recently switched over to my videos doing 30 frames per second in all of my videos, and it does give me a little bit smoother pans. Now if a customer asks me for a 24 frames per second video, I will deliver it, but that's the flexibility that 60 frames per second allows you to do. You can drop it into a 30 frames per second timeline, or you can drop it into a 24 frames per second timeline and still get really smooth results. So it's a really versatile frame rate. And because I'm allowed to slow it down, it just gives me some added flexibility. Now with 30 frames per second, I can slow it down up to 50% and not notice any degradation or any stutter or jerk in the video. Now with the 24 frames per second, you can technically slow it down to up to 40% without really noticing a tremendous amount of jerk, which I think is perfect. Now for the color profile, I do shoot in F-Log. Now, is that more work for me in post? Yes, it is, but it's totally worth it because what I find with F-Log is one, setting the camera to auto white balance, I have a lot of flexibility. With my Sony cameras, I never trust it enough to set this to an auto white balance when working in a home because there was always this sort of magenta color shift in my videos. Now with Fuji, I don't notice that. And one of the most underrated things about this camera is the white balance. It is really, really accurate and fast to change, and it's almost so smooth that it works so well. I wish they were able to get their auto exposure down to the point where their white balance is this smooth, but maybe that's something they can update later on. Another thing that Fuji does offer is the ability to lock your white balance down. Now, Sony recently introduced this and was great, but it wasn't on the A7 III. All the Fuji cameras currently do offer locking the white balance. So because of this, I find myself using auto white balance. And when I'm in a tricky situation where I think the white balance will change, I'll just simply lock it down. So with that being said, do I deliver my videos in a full 4K file? Absolutely not. I'll typically downsample those out to 1080p, which gives me a nice crispy file. As far as my other settings in codecs goes, I'm using Longop. I'm only filming at 100 megabits per second. Unless if I feel that the project needs to be done quickly, then I'll bump the megabits up, or maybe I'll consider going to all intra. I do use the ability to run 10-bit color, so I am filming in 10-bit, so that's H.265. Again, my PC is pretty much equipped to handle anything that I throw at it, so that's something to keep in mind as well. So my workflow will vary differently than yours, but I prefer the ability to still have the 10-bit color to be able to push it around a little bit more in post. It's greatly improved the quality of videos that I'm getting out of the houses. All right, let's talk about lenses because this is a big one here. So I have 3 lenses set off to the side here, and I'll start off with my video lens first, and that is the Laowa 9mm Cine. So this lens is absolutely stunning. I filmed on the Laowa 9mm at Sony, but that was the photography edition. This is the Cine version, and you can see it has focus rings, focus gears already on here. However, I don't use any sort of follow focus. I set it to infinity and call it a day. The aperture is a 2.9 aperture, so it's not the fastest end of aperture, but it's definitely enough to give you a really, really clean image, especially in a dark home. It's also wide enough that you can capture most of the house without being distorted, which is something that is hard to find with such a wide angle lens. Now, the equivalent to this in a full frame is going to put you right at that 13mm mark. Now, technically speaking, that's almost too wide in most instances, but with the crop factor in 4K 60, and if you have stabilization in, it's going to crop in just a tiny bit more. So you're right at about the 14 to 15mm mark at that point, which is perfect for real estate videos. Now, one thing that this lens has going for it differently than its brother from the photography side is that the lens hood area is a lot bigger. Now, while you're not going to be able to put any sort of lens hood on here, there's not even a way to do that. You can put ND filters on here and you can put a UV filter on here without the worry about getting any sort of vignette in. There's also more lens elements, and the design of this lens is a little bit differently, in which I've noticed less vignetting and color shift around the edges of my image. With the Sony lens, I would always have to do a reverse vignette to be able to remove some of those dark shadowy areas from the corners of my videos. So that was a problem that I faced with that. Now with this, again, I keep it in f2.9 and just set it to infinity and it works great. Now you can use this lens for photography, which I have used it in some really tight bathrooms because it can open up a shot and allow me to fit more into a photo than you typically can with the lens I'm about to talk to next. Now the price of this one is about $500. It's on the more expensive end of things, but for what it does, if you do this type of work, it's honestly invaluable and it's paid for itself over and over again. All right, so let's talk about the lens I'm using for photography. This lens could be used for video as well, and I have used it for video when I did Sony, but this is the most common lens that I've seen in real estate today. It's also the most cheap lens that I can recommend, and it's honestly, this is the best lens you can get when it comes to real estate, for the price anyways. This is a 12mm Samyang f2, and it's one of the fastest wide-angle lenses that you're going to be able to find on an APS-C body. So with that f2 lens, if you are using this for video, it's still pretty much tack sharp around the edges and even in the center of the video. But for photo, I keep this at f8, f7, just about like right there, about a click there. That's about f7.1. It is a manual focus lens. So I set this to just before infinity. I don't hit the infinity logo. I just go just a little bit before. That's where I find that the center of focus, that's like its sweet spot basically. Now I've seen some people that do this, basically regularly. They just tape this down so they never have to worry about the focus changing. But I usually double check my focus before I start going. Now the lens hood is a 67mm thread, so you can put ND filters on here. It does have a lens hood, which I find to be somewhat useful. It's better than not having one at all. It doesn't seem to impede on the shot. However, this lens, while it's got a lot of strong suits, it does have some weak points, and that's basically the loss of contrast if you hit direct sunlight with this. So I have to be really careful and critical when I am taking photos, but for the most part, this is what I do all of my real estate photos on as of late. It was $279, and it's honestly the most bang for buck value when you're talking about a lens in real estate photography. Now, I would love to have the Fuji 10 to 24mm, but unfortunately, the new version's coming out and the old version hasn't been discounted yet. So I'm sort of in a quandary. Do I wait for the new version? Do I get the old version and just see if they're going to reduce the price? I'm not really sure yet, so I'm still trying to think about that. But for an interim, this is working just fine. It takes great photos, great sharpness, and you don't have to worry about any sort of autofocus issues with this lens. Now, the only limit to this is the fact that it is 12mm, and I do find myself backing up quite a bit on photos. I do wish to have a 10mm. I think that is, for me, the sweet spot when it comes to real estate. But honestly, this is getting the job done, and nobody's even said that, oh, your shots aren't wide enough. So 12mm works just as well, and it's a lens that I can't recommend enough. Now, when it comes to video or detail shots, I am using the Viltrox 23mm f1.4. This allows me to get those really shallow, out of focus shots, shallow depth of field, out of focus background shots. But yeah, this is the 23mm, and I do have a Moment Cinebloom lens on here. I use this because it gives sort of more of a, a dreamy vibe when you're looking through a house, especially when you're getting some of those really fine details around the stove or something. I like the way it blooms around certain lights, especially when I'm dealing with a propane or a gas stove. It just gives a really unique look. So 23mm f1.4 is phenomenal when it comes to detail shots. As a matter of fact, this lens is the one I've done most of my talking headshots on. Right now I'm filming on the 16mm f1.4, which could also be good for detail shots because it does have a very close focusing distance. But if you want to save yourself some money, this would be the one I would get. All in all these lenses are all really cheap. $279, $300, and $500. You're just at about $1,000 for 3 Fuji lenses, which is pretty damn incredible. Now, I want to talk about the SD cards that I do use because I've had a lot of failures with SD cards, primarily coming around SanDisks. I've recently switched to Sony SD cards. Now, these are the tough cards. These things are made like tanks, and they work really well. They also have a high enough write speed to accommodate all the fast footage coming out of the Fuji XT4, along with good storage options like 128 gigs. So both of these cards are 128 gigs, and you can hear I just dropped it. It is all metal, and I don't have to worry about breaking or these cards flaking as I put them in or use them daily. Now, I haven't had any problems with loss of data on either one of these. They work great. So I use the Fuji, or I should say Fuji. I use the Sony Tough cards for all of my professional work. So now this does get more expensive if you want 2 of these matching cards to fill up both slots on either one of these cameras, but that's just what I recommend. All right, so the gimbal I have been using is the Ronin SE2. This thing has been absolutely phenomenal. If you didn't check out the video I did on this, I love this gimbal. Price to performance, this thing is an absolute beast, and it just gives you a lot of great options when you're going through the home. Also, because the Fuji system cameras aren't too heavy and they're not too big, this will be able to accommodate all these lenses so easily with what I just talked about, and have plenty of headroom. So this is, to me, probably the perfect gimbal. I love this little feature here that I can just go ahead and throw it into like an underslung mode. Like, to me, this is just so very useful. And the fact that you can pack this one up a bit smaller than you can the other gimbals, it's versatile and it just works really well. I think for real estate, the SE2 is probably the best bang for buck value, just because of all the capability that this gimbal has at an affordable price point, and it does have a pretty respectable payload capacity. Alrighty, and as for drones, I can't recommend the Mavic Air 2 enough. This thing has been pretty damn awesome on many shoots as of recent. I've used the Mavic 2 Pro quite a bit, but I found myself gravitating towards the Mavic Air 2, simply because it's super small and easy to pack into my bag. And it just works. The battery life is great. I can go from shoot to shoot and not really have to worry about charging batteries. They're small enough, light enough. This is sort of an unobtrusive drone, and decine-alike is more than enough to color grade. I find I still get great dynamic range. I shoot in auto bracketed exposures with this, and I get the shot and I'm done. And it was super cheap. Now, for a lot of real estate videographers and photographers, you're probably not too concerned with aerials. For the most part, these are probably more of those things that you offer, but it's not your starlight feature as to why agents are going to use you. So I don't really recommend spending buku bucks on a drone. It's probably not a good idea, especially in 2020, to spend a tremendous amount of money on a drone. And if you want to go even cheaper, you can go with his little brother, the Mavic Mini 2, which will get you some great shots, albeit they're not going to be super professional if you do video. If you do video, I can't recommend the Mavic Air 2 more than enough. Decine-alike is great, super versatile, and the color profile matches up to Eterna very well with some slight tweaks. Yeah, so there you go. This is the real estate kit that I've been using. This is what I've done the vast majority of my shoots on over the past couple of weeks. And pretty happy with all of the gear that I just talked about here. I have zero complaints, and honestly, I know a lot of people in my Fuji video like, oh, you'll be back to Sony. And I definitely won't be, not for a long time, because these cameras have really increased my workflow and made it super easy to blow through houses as fast as I possibly can. So zero complaints, zero regrets, and the fact that I saved a tremendous amount of money. And if you're looking to do real estate and videography work, this can save you a pretty good chunk of coin as well. All right, that's gonna do it. I hope you enjoyed. Stay original. What are you guys doing? You guys still here? Well, if you want, you can check out this card right up top here. That will take you to another video. If not, you can click the subscribe button over there. Or is this wrong? Is it no? Card up here